At the beginning of the story, we see a man named Frank standing outside his house, smoking a cigarette. And then, he sees something strange. A beautiful, shimmering light appears in the sky. The Northern Lights. Normally, you can only see them around the North Pole. But that night, somehow, they were visible from New York City. Frank didn't pay much attention. He had a large radio that he used to communicate with strangers. It was his hobby. But that night, when he turned it on, something impossible happened. He spoke to his own son. A voice that told him, "Dad, I'm 36 years old now." Somehow, his radio had picked up a signal from the future. 30 years from now. And then, his son said something that made Frank's blood run cold. "Dad, save yourself. You're going to die today." Frank was stunned. How was any of this possible? To understand, we need to know Frank a little better. He's a firefighter. A hero. His stories of bravery are known throughout the city. Just hours earlier, a tanker full of petrol had crashed and overturned into a gutter. 2 electricians were working downstairs at that exact moment. Petrol started dripping down, and just one small spark could blow everything up. A team of firefighters arrived. Frank came with them. He risked his own life to save both electricians, pulling them out just moments before the explosion. Many women were smitten with Frank after hearing stories of his bravery. But Frank only loves 2 people in this world. His wife, Julia, and his son, John. Julia is a nurse at the hospital. She treats her patients like they're part of her own family. Now, the story returns to where it began. That night, the sky was filled with that strange light. And exactly 30 years later, the same light appeared again. John is now a 36-year-old police detective. He's an expert at catching criminals. But in his personal life, he's lost. His girlfriend left him because he couldn't move past his old traumas. You see, his father died on that very night 30 years ago. John was only 6 years old. Frank went to put out a fire in a warehouse, but only his charred body came back. That day, John lost everything. And 36 years later, he still mourns that loss. His home is still filled with memories of his father. Old photographs. Baseballs. Trophies. And the same table where Frank used to sit and play with his radio. When John returned home from visiting his mother, Julia, his childhood friend, Gordo, was there with his son. While playing, Gordo's son found Frank's old radio. The sight brought back so many memories. A short while later, Gordo and his son left. The radio was still on. John started watching TV. And then, he heard a voice on the radio. CQ-15. CQ-15. Come in. Is anyone listening? John walked over to the microphone. Hello, I'm calling from New York City. My name is John. Who are you? The voice on the other end said, I thought this radio could talk to China or Japan. But you're from my city. By the way, John, if you're from New York, there's a big baseball game tomorrow. Which team are you supporting? John was confused. Because the game this man was talking about, happened 30 years ago. Are you kidding me? John said. I'm 30 years old. Why would I watch an old game? The radio went silent for a few moments. Then John heard something strange. The man was talking to someone else. He heard him say, Little Chief. John's heart stopped. That was the exact name his father used to call him when he was a child. Who are you? John asked, his voice shaking. Frank, came the reply. John's face turned pale. He thought it must be a sick joke from Gordo. Gordo, this isn't funny. I'll see you tomorrow. But the voice said, Gordo. You mean my neighbor's son? Do I sound like a child to you? I'm really Frank Solovyov. And since you know my neighbor, tell me, who are you? John shouted, Stop talking nonsense. Frank Solovyov is my father's name. He died 30 years ago. This is his son. John Solovyov, speaking from his home in Queens, New York. The man on the other end fell silent. And then, his face appeared on the radio. John was stunned. It was really Frank. His father. The man who had died 30 years ago. All of this was happening. It was nothing short of a miracle. That day, both Frank and John saw that strange flash in the sky at the same time. And somehow, through magic or fate, their radios had connected across 30 years. Neither of them could believe it. In his panic, Frank made a mistake. He dropped his cigarette on the table. It landed on something flammable, and the wood started to burn. But Frank saw it and quickly put out the fire. Meanwhile, 30 years later, John was sitting at the same table, with the same radio. Suddenly, the same burn mark appeared on his table. John was astonished. Now he understood. He was really talking to his father. He said, "I can see where you burned the table." Frank felt the ground slip out from under him when he heard that. It felt like someone was standing right next to him. And that's when everything changes. But that's coming up next. Frank shouted into the radio, "Who are you? Stay away from my family, or I'll break your bones, understand?" John replied, "You have to stay alive too, Dad. You're going to die." Then John told him, "There's going to be a fire in a warehouse tomorrow morning. You're going to put it out, and you'll die there." Frank said, "What nonsense are you talking about?" But John interrupted him. "Listen to me carefully. When you go to put out the fire, don't go through the window exit. Go through the other exit. The other side. Do you understand?" Frank turned off the radio. He still thought someone was messing with him. The next morning, when Frank arrived at the station, he heard that a warehouse had indeed caught fire. Now he started to believe. Frank and his team arrived at the scene. The fire was intense. A woman came running, crying, "My daughter, she's trapped inside." Frank paused for a moment. A little afraid that this might be the day he would die. But still, he didn't forget his duty. He somehow managed to get inside and reached the upper floor. There he found the girl, unconscious. He picked her up on his shoulder and carried her to the window. His team tried to reach them with a ladder, but the mechanism failed. Then Frank remembered John's words. He immediately ran to the other side, and escaped through the ventilator. Now, 30 years later, John was sitting with Gordo and a police officer named Satch. Satch was an old friend of Frank's. Today marked 30 years since Frank's death. So the three of them were talking about it. John was still convinced that last night's radio incident was just a dream. But then, suddenly, new memories started flooding into his mind. Memories he never knew he had. Moments with his father that he never lived. He remembered going to school with his father. Playing together. As if Frank had never died. Suddenly, John's glass fell from his hand. He said, "My father didn't die in the fire 30 years ago." Gordo and Satch were shocked. Gordo said, "What are you talking about? Your father died of cancer 10 years ago." John smiled. He realized what had happened. He had actually spoken to his father, and Frank had listened. That's why he survived the fire. Now a new memory flashed through his mind. Frank was a chain smoker. As soon as one cigarette finished, he would light another. That habit eventually gave him cancer. Back in the past, Frank rescued the girl from the burning building. And in that same room, a massive explosion happened exactly where he had been standing. If he had stayed there, he would have died. Now Frank was convinced. The voice on the radio was actually his son, 30 years in the future. Frank went home and tried to call John again, but there was no signal. Meanwhile, John was overjoyed. When he returned home that night, he saw that all the photos had changed. That newspaper clipping that once reported Frank's death. Now it said, "Firefighter saves girl." And on the table, it read, "I'm alive." "Yes, Chief." Tears filled John's eyes. The two reconnected on the radio and talked for a long time. John told his father everything about the future. Who would win the baseball game that year? When to buy the car he always wanted. Everything. And then finally, he told him the hardest truth of all. "Dad, you're going to die of cancer. Because of your chain smoking. Please, quit smoking." Frank became emotional. The next day, Frank went to the hospital to visit his wife, Julia. Julia was treating a patient. When she saw Frank, she told her junior to take over, and then came over to him. Frank was filled with joy. It was like he had been given a second life. As they were talking, Julia noticed her junior about to give the wrong medication. She rushed over and stopped him, saving the patient's life. Frank expressed his love for her, and then returned home. Meanwhile, John was asleep, when he had a strange dream. In the dream, a family member had died. Her funeral was underway. Little John sat in a corner, terrified and crying. Then he spotted his mother's locket. John woke up suddenly, drenched in sweat. But the strangest part? He didn't forget the dream. Every face. Every moment. It was still there. As if it wasn't a dream at all, but a memory. Alarmed, John called his mother. But a strange woman answered the phone. He called again. Same thing. He thought maybe it was a network problem. Then he went to meet his girlfriend, Samantha. Now that his father was alive, his heart felt lighter. He wanted to apologize. But as soon as he saw Samantha, she didn't even recognize him. It was like they had never met. John was stunned. Maybe she was just acting out of anger, he thought. Then he went back to work at the police station. But even there, things felt wrong. And that's when everything starts to unravel. John's boss, Satch, who had always treated him like a friend, suddenly changed. He started treating John badly. Satch handed John a case file. They had both been working on it for a few days. A few days earlier, at a construction site, a buried body had been found. Only bones remained. Satch determined that it belonged to Mary Finley, a nurse who had worked at Nightingale Hospital. She was the first victim of a serial killer named Nightingale, who, 30 years ago, had selectively targeted nurses. What a pity, Satch said. 30 years ago, 10 people were killed. And the police never caught him. John was shocked. He had always thought that Nightingale had killed just 3 nurses 30 years ago, and then suddenly disappeared. But when he looked at the murder file again, the ground beneath his feet slipped away. His mother Julia's name was on the victim list. John's mind went into a tailspin. He ran home, and found Julia missing from the family photo. Then he realized something terrifying. The changes he had made yesterday to save his father, had completely transformed his life today. He immediately used the radio to contact his father in the past. Dad, huge changes are coming. The serial killer Nightingale, he's going to kill my mother. Your wife. Frank was completely shocked. What are you talking about? When will this happen? Tell me quickly. John said, on the night of October 22nd. That's about a week from now in your time. Then John asked, Dad, did you do anything at the hospital yesterday that might not have happened otherwise? Frank thought for a moment. After escaping death yesterday. I was so happy that I went to visit your mother at the hospital. John realized it immediately. Something must have happened at the hospital that day, which led to his mother's death in the future. But Frank said, don't worry, John. If I know for sure that Nightingale will try to kill Julia on October 22nd, then I will not let that happen. Not even Nightingale's shadow will touch my wife. John replied, Dad, she'll be saved. But think about this. Nightingale had killed 2 women before Mom. And after Mom, he would have killed 4 more innocent women. All of that happened because of our interference. Are we just going to let them die? John knew exactly which woman Nightingale was going to kill next. But Frank didn't know what to do. I can't go to the police and tell them Nightingale is going to kill someone. They'll laugh at me. John said, Dad, this isn't the police's job. This is your job. You need to follow that woman and find out who Nightingale really is. Once we identify him, maybe the police can catch him. Frank agreed. He was scared. But he mustered up his courage and went to the bar John had mentioned, the very place where the next murder was about to happen. The target was a nurse named Carrie. She was supposed to arrive that evening. John had read the police file. He told Frank that Carrie would leave the bar at 7:30, and her body would be found behind the bar at 8 o'clock. That meant the attack would happen between 7:30 and 8 o'clock. John told Frank sternly, watch for anyone following Carrie when she leaves the bar. And then, call the police immediately. Frank was already sitting at the bar when Carrie arrived with her friends. The women recognized him immediately. He was the brave firefighter who had recently rescued the girl from the burning building. They were impressed. They spent hours chatting with him. But Frank didn't realize that Nightingale was also sitting quietly at the bar, watching him. Nightingale was actually the same man who had been Julia's patient at the hospital. Now, everything became clear. If John hadn't intervened, Frank would have died in the fire. Julia's attention would have shifted to the news of her husband's death. She would have left the hospital. Her junior would have given Nightingale the wrong medication, and killed him accidentally. That would have been the end of it. But now, Frank survived. Julia didn't leave the hospital. Frank went to see her, and Julia stopped the junior from making that fatal mistake. That's where all the trouble began. Nightingale survived. And he kept killing nurses. But today, Frank had accidentally ruined Nightingale's plan. He didn't let him kill Carrie. And in the future, Carrie's case file disappeared from police records. John was overjoyed. But Nightingale still had more targets. John told Frank that the next target was a nurse named Cece Clark. She worked nights at the hospital, and also as a waitress at a club. Nightingale was planning to kill her that night. Between 2 o'clock and 5 o'clock in the morning. Frank rushed to the bar. Cece was there. Frank waited, from 2 o'clock until closing time. Finally, when it was time to close, Cece went upstairs to change. Frank went to the bathroom and kept watch. And then, suddenly, someone attacked him from behind. It was Nightingale. Frank tried to fight back, but Nightingale overpowered him and knocked him down. And that's where the danger peaks. Nightingale knocked Frank unconscious. Then he stole Frank's wallet, took his driver's license, and fled. When Frank regained consciousness, he immediately ran upstairs to find Cece. But Nightingale had already killed her. Terrified, Frank returned home and told John everything. He had failed to save Cece. And now Nightingale had his driver's license. His situation just got much worse. They still didn't know who Nightingale was. But now, Nightingale knew everything about Frank. He might even go after Julia and little John. Frank was frightened. But John encouraged him. After a moment of thought, John suddenly had an idea. "Dad, if Nightingale touched your wallet, his fingerprints must be on it. Now listen carefully. Hide your wallet somewhere special. Somewhere no one can touch it for the next 30 years. Frank did exactly that. He packed his wallet in a packet and carefully hid it in an old wooden box near the window of the house. 30 years later, the older John opened that box. And the wallet was there. Intact. John happily told Frank on the radio, "Don't worry, Dad. I'll find out who Nightingale is." John immediately took the wallet to the police station to have the fingerprints tested. But the results shocked everyone. Nightingale was no ordinary man. He was a retired police officer. His name was Jack Shepherd. John found Jack, who was still alive and living a respectable life. John talked to him carefully, hiding his true intentions, and gathered as much information as he could. Then he went home and radioed Frank. "Dad. Nightingale's real name is Jack Shepherd. And he's a cop." John advised his father to call the FBI from a public phone and tell them that Jack was the serial killer who had been murdering nurses. After each murder, he kept something from his victims, like a locket or a piece of jewelry. Hopefully, when the FBI raided Jack's house, they would find all the evidence and send him to prison forever. But luck was not on their side. Before Frank could do anything, Police Chief Satch arrived at his house. Some neighbors had seen Frank when he went to rescue Cece. And worst of all, Jack had found Frank's driver's license. Satch became convinced that Frank was Cece's murderer. The real Nightingale. Satch arrested Frank and forcibly took him to the police station. During the struggle, Frank's radio fell to the ground and broke. In the present, John's radio also went silent at the same time. Father and son were now disconnected. Satch began interrogating Frank. Frank tried to tell him the truth. He claimed he had been talking to his future son on the radio, and that his son had revealed the real killer was Jack Shepherd. The same Nightingale who had been killing nurses one by one. But Satch didn't believe a word of it. He thought Frank was making up nonsense to save himself. Frank tried so hard to convince him. He even told him the results of baseball matches that John had told him about the future. But Satch got so irritated that he stopped listening entirely. Then Julia went to the police station to see Frank. But Satch refused to let them meet. Instead, he took her to a cafe and told her that her husband was a serial killer. Meanwhile, Frank was locked up in his cell. And then Shepard arrived. He was also a cop, so he used his power to get into the custody area. He pulled out his gun and pointed it directly at Frank. He was about to kill him right there. But then, another officer entered the room. Jack quickly hid his intentions and acted innocent. He talked to the officer and walked out with him. Frank panicked. He knew Jack would be back. Then he noticed an electric wire. He tied it to his cell, and attached it to the iron door. Then he waited for Jack. At the cafe, Satch was still talking to Julia. "Your husband is a murderer," he said. Julia was devastated. But then Satch's attention was drawn to the baseball match on TV. And everything was happening exactly the way Frank had predicted. That's when Satch started to wonder, maybe Frank was telling the truth. Everything on that TV was happening exactly as Frank had predicted. Satch was shocked. He didn't know how, but Frank was telling the truth. Meanwhile, Jack snuck back into Frank's cell to kill him. But as soon as he touched the metal door, he received a massive electric shock. He collapsed, unconscious. Frank searched Jack's pockets and found his own driver's license. Then he activated the police station's fire alarm. The entire area flooded with water, and in the chaos, Frank escaped. He was determined to prove his innocence and expose Jack as the real murderer. Frank went straight to Jack's house. He started searching for anything that could link Jack to the other murders. And he found everything he was looking for. But then Jack came home. Frank grabbed the evidence and ran. Jack chased him, firing his gun whenever he had a clear shot. They ran all the way to the port. Frank suddenly disappeared. Jack started searching for him. And then Frank emerged from under the dock. He pulled Jack into the water, and used a screwdriver to kill him. Frank soon climbed out of the water. Shortly after, Satch arrived with his entire team. They had found evidence at Jack's house proving he was the real murderer. Satch took Frank's statement and sent divers to retrieve Jack's body. Frank was cleared of all charges. Frank went home. He sat down comfortably and started fixing his broken radio. Then he saw a pack of cigarettes on the table. He picked it up, and threw it in the trash. He had made a decision. "I'm not going to die of cancer. I'm going to stay with Julia and John. I won't leave them." Then he turned on the radio. The connection was back. Frank said, "It's all right, son. Jack Shepard is dead." But John noticed something terrible. Nothing had changed in the present. His mother was still missing from the family photo. While he was talking to Frank, someone punched him from behind, knocking him to the ground. It was none other than the present-day Jack. Still alive. Still hunting. At the same time, 30 years ago, the past Jack had also attacked Frank. He knocked Frank unconscious and went straight to Julia's room to kill her. But then, little John burst into the room. His voice distracted Jack, and Julia attacked him. She clawed at his face with her nails. Instantly, the same scratch marks appeared on old Jack's face in the present. Jack punched Julia, knocking her unconscious. Then he picked up little John and started carrying him away. When he came downstairs, he saw Frank standing in front of him with a gun. Jack pushed little John forward and said, "Put the gun down, or I'll break his neck." Frank had no choice. He put the gun down. Now Frank, Julia, and little John were all in danger. And 30 years later, Jack was holding a gun to the older John's head. He was about to pull the trigger. Just then, the past Julia attacked Jack from behind. Frank immediately grabbed his gun. Jack pushed Julia away and lunged at Frank. But Frank fired. The bullet blew Jack's hand clean off. And at that exact moment, in the present day, Jack's hand disappeared. Because 30 years ago, he had already lost it. Now Frank, Julia, and John were out of danger. And then, everything began to change. The house. The walls. The photos. Everything felt brand new. But the danger wasn't completely over. The present-day Jack still had a gun. He aimed it at John. He was about to fire. But someone else fired first. Jack was gone forever. The shooter was Frank. John's father. Frank was still alive in this timeline. After everything, he had survived. And Julia? John's girlfriend Samantha came back into his life. At first, she seemed like a stranger, but they eventually married and had a beautiful son. If you liked this video, please hit that like button, and subscribe to the channel. See you in the next one.